Hello, this is Keith Patterson. You're listening to 90% Half True. And it is January 21st, 2025. This is the first podcast of the year. And I'd like to jump right in and read a story to you. This is my very latest. It's dedicated to the late, great Dan Aschenbrenner, who just left this earthly plane here about a month ago. And he is Captain Dan to those who know and love him. And this story is called Bear Hunting on Acid. As Dr. Squiggy administered the ether to himself, Captain Dan used the cheap rum to rinse the jerky stains from his calloused hands into the chum bucket and prepared to get down to serious business. "I love surgery," said Captain Dan, "almost as much as moose jerky or a pan-seared halibut steak or bear hunting on acid." I was laid out on my back below deck on the hardwood fish cleaning station slab. It wasn't at all a comfortable place to lay my head, but I was in trouble, and getting help was the only comfort that I sought. "Dr. Squiggy, give the man some ether," commanded Captain Dan. Dr. Squiggy hesitated. I looked up at Dr. Squiggy's broad, bearded face, twisted into a maniacal grin. "We're fresh out," he replied, and then howled with laughter. "God damn it, Dr. Squiggy, you sick fucker," screamed Captain Dan at his first mate. The captain shook his head in disgust as he removed a vial of clear liquid from the breast pocket of his orca skin camouflage jacket. "We don't need no fucking ether," Captain Dan reassured me. "This stuff is even better for you, and no hangover." His eyes lit up. "Here you go, laddie buck. Open up your yap. I'm going to put a few drops under your tongue." I complied, and Captain Dan squirted a full stopper of the liquid into his own mouth before placing a few drops of the clear fluid underneath of my tongue. "There now, laddie buck. You just relax and leave it to me and Dr. Squiggy. Everything is gonna be just fine." Dr. Squiggy and Captain Dan simultaneously burst into rolling peals of laughter. I was scared, and I knew that my life was on the line. But my would-be saviors were by my side and more than willing to use all of their considerable skills to save me. "What was that in the vial?" I asked Captain Dan. "Oh, don't you worry about a thing, laddie buck." Captain Dan's eyes were swimming with stars, and my own head started to feel strangely light and unburdened. "That was some good old LSD. Acid, pure as sunlight and made by Dr. Squiggy himself." Dr. Squiggy and Captain Dan again burst into wild laughter. I closed my eyes and listened through my eyelids at the maniacal laughter of my surgical team. It was weirdly reassuring, and as I felt myself drifting off towards a waking dream, the events that had led me to this critical juncture flashed and flooded through my mind. My first heart attack had occurred some 30-odd years ago and had robbed me of a great deal of my life force. It was a massive cardiac event, and as I lay in recovery at the hospital in Charlottesville, I heard the doctor, who'd just put 3 stents in my heart, tell my first wife that I had effectively lost 80% of my heart's function. I lay in that hospital bed for 5 days and nights, and when I finally got discharged, I was back up on a roof in 90-degree heat, trying to finish a job and get a check. Functioning on 20% of my heart didn't really register with me back then as being such a huge game changer. I was a home improvements contractor, and I had jobs to do, mouths to feed, and men to pay. And even though I was always invited to join Captain Dan and his merry crew on these yearly hunts into the wilds of his native Alaska, I never really felt physically up to it. That first heart attack happened at a drunken Memorial Day party in 1999. After my release from the hospital, I worked hard through the summer and early fall, and then in November, it happened again. I was out running at night not far from my home on the jogging path along Holmes Run in Alexandria, Virginia, when I felt the pressure in my chest. I had no choice but to lay down in the middle of the jogging path. There was no denying what was happening. A fellow jogger who happened to be a nurse stopped to help me. She ran to the closest paved road and flagged down a policeman, and I ended up in the inn of a hospital and received 2 more stents. After a couple of nights in the medical facility, I was back at work and up on a ladder, and I never really took my foot off the gas for the next 20 years. I was diminished physically, to be sure, but I had to do what I had to do. Type 1 diabetes didn't help matters any, but I struggled on. My first marriage fell apart, and I found myself out on my own without medical insurance, and I lost contact with my cardiologist. My endocrinologist, Dr. Koo, kept me close and supplied me with free insulin, and is surely the main reason that I remained alive during this difficult time. Somehow, in the midst of life's struggles, true love finally found me. And with my second marriage to wonderful, beautiful Kelly and the birth of the Affordable Care Act, I once again had health insurance and a new cardiologist. My new cardiologist, Dr. Anise, immediately put me on a treadmill for a stress test EKG, and once again I found myself in the hospital, this time in Loudoun County, Virginia, and received 2 more coronary stents. That made 7 in all. My wife, Kelly, did some research and found a book on heart-healthy recipes and a book by Dr. Esselstyn. And after several years with strict adherence to their new no-fat diet, a lot of exercise, the steadfast love of my wife, and the shepherding care of Dr. Anise, I made some progress with my heart disease. But alack, diet, love, and exercise could only get me so far. And after a disappointing sonogram, Dr. Anise said to me, "Your heart disease is mostly gone, but your heart is still very weak. The plumber has done all that he can do. Now it is time to see the electrician." Dr. Anise gave me a referral and a phone number, and my wife and I made an appointment to see the new doctor. The electrophysiologist, Dr. Atiga, walked into the exam room where Kelly and I were waiting. We were smiling and giggling like we always do, but the seriously worried look on Dr. Atiga's face wiped the smiles off both of our faces. Dr. Atiga looked down at the paper in his hand. "This is the EKG that my nurse just administered. Do you understand what kind of shape you're in?" the doctor asked me. I stammered. "I did my 300 squats this morning like I always do." "You mean you can walk up the flight of stairs and do squats?" Dr. Atiga asked. He looked doubtful. "Sure," I answered. There was a long moment of silence. "Let me put this to you plainly," Dr. Atiga began. "Half of your heart doesn't really pump blood at all. It just sort of sloshes it around. And the other half of your heart is like a 4-cylinder beater with only 2 cylinders firing. And every other beat, it's a different 2 cylinders that are firing. Your heart runs on electrical impulses, and essentially, your heart's electrical system is fried. And you are in the top 1% of cardiac patients most likely to have a fatal coronary event at any second." That mechanical metaphor of my situation by Dr. Atiga really got my attention. And within a week, I was in Reston Hospital to get a pacemaker installed. Because of my dire condition, I was scheduled to get the model with a built-in defibrillator and 3 lead wires implanted into the most damaged areas of my heart. That week of waiting between Dr. Atiga's vivid description of my situation and the day of my surgery were the most fraught with worry of any days that I could remember. But the staff at the hospital were competent, professional, and reassuring. And as I got wheeled into the clean, brightly lit operating room, laid out on the operating table, hooked up to the anesthetic drip, and took a couple of deep breaths off the oxygen mask, my anxiety melted away. "Mr. Curtis, throttle down," barked Captain Dan. "Aye, Captain," returned Mr. Curtis from up on the bridge above deck. I could hear the 5 outdoor diesels throttle down in a dull roar. And even though my ears were stuffed with cotton by Dr. Squiggy for some reason, with the lessening of the diesel throb, I could hear other sounds. I could hear them through the closed lids of my eyelids. I knew from experience that it was Dr. Squiggy's pure LSD that was blurring my senses together. I was hearing through my eyelids, seeing through my cotton-gobbed ear holes, smelling through my fingertips. I knew that it was all part of the process, and I was grateful. I heard the sounds of the gulls and seabirds that followed Captain Dan's boat, a 45-foot seiner named the Lorna Doom. Those godless flying scavengers followed the Lorna Doom far out to sea, confident in the bounty of Captain Dan's chum bucket and the generosity of his hand. I could hear the gentle crash of 10-foot waves against the boat, like a lullaby compared to the violent collision with the enraged orca not an hour hence. Big Mama, Captain Dan had called her. It was her knocking against the boat violently that had caused me to lose my new pacemaker, to split the stitches, and it squirted out of my chest and rattled across the Lorna Doom's heaving deck, fomenting the impending emergency medical surgery that would save my life. I heard the low rumble of a big ship's horn off in the distance, and some excited chatter from up on the bridge between Mr. Curtis, Lucky Larry, and Philistine Ted. Then I heard Philistine Ted howl, "It's that fucking Russian tuna trawler again, closing off starboard." "Fire one across the bow," shouted Captain Dan. "Chum the water first." I could hear Philistine Ted and Mr. Curtis turning the gears of the 77-meter howitzer as Lucky Larry instructed the men on distance, direction, and loft, all while chumming the water fore and aft. A shell was breached and Lucky Larry barked, "Locked, loaded, and chummed, Captain." There was a long moment of pause as Captain Dan waited for the Russian trawler to come into range and for the chum to attract game fish. "Fire!" howled Captain Dan, standing 2 inches from my chest. "Kaboom!" the howitzer roared. I cracked open one eye and watched the seasoned crew as they watched the 77-meter explosive projectile sail over top of the bow of the Russian trawler and explode upon contact with the ocean surface just past the hull of the massive boat. "That'll give 'em something to chew on," said Captain Dan. "Man the nets!" The big gun, salvaged from a decommissioned World War II battleship, was welded to the keel of the Lorna Doom, and every time that it was fired, the violent keel vibration stunned any fish within 500 feet of the boat in all directions. The Russian tuna trawler reversed its engines and changed direction. "Yay!" roared the crew of the Lorna Doom, and despite the severity of my predicament, I was smiling and cheering along with the rest of them. As Philistine Ted, Mr. Curtis, and Lucky Larry reeled out the seine net to haul in the stunned catch that was floating to the surface, Captain Dan gave instructions to Dr. Squiggy, his first mate and surgical assistant. "Disconnect the battery from the port side outboard and set it here next to Laddiebuck. Bring me a few strands of copper wire, the thin neck long hook tongs, some thin gauge leader wire, and a medium-sized hook. Disconnect the battery from the starboard motor, hook it up to the arc welder, and spark that puppy up." I ventured a peek out from my languishing eyelids. Captain Dan and Dr. Squiggy were grinning like wild men. "Dr. Squiggy, fetch me the sharpest knife in the toolbox and a bottle of the good rum." To sterilize the knife and the tongs?" asked Dr. Squiggy. "Fuck no," explained Captain Dan. "I need a fucking drink." My head was swimming with visions of eternity and beyond as I heard Dr. Squiggy fire up the arc welder. Skrank, skrank, skrank. Open up your yap, laddie buck, said Captain Dan as he placed his hand under my head and lifted me up enough to take a sizable swig from the bottle of the good rum. I choked a bit on the liquid fire as Captain Dan gently laid my head back down on the hard slab of the fish cleaning station. He then took a mighty draught of the golden elixir and handed the bottle to Dr. Squiggy, who followed suit. Warmth flowed into, across, and through my body. But Captain Dan is not a man to take unnecessary chances. So he retrieved the stoppered bottle of clear liquid from his jacket pocket and squirted a few more drops into the corner of my mouth for good measure. He administered a few more drops of the clear liquid under Dr. Squiggy's tongue and then gave himself a purposeful squirt as well. Skrank, skrank, skrank. Keep her steady, Mr. Curtis. I'm going in. Were the last sounds that I remember hearing until I woke up some hours later to the jackhammer sounding of my own heartbeat. A 30-pound 12-volt marine battery was sitting on top of my heaving rib cage, just below my pacemaker, which was gleefully pounding away just beneath the skin of my chest, almost exactly where it had been before the vengeance-filled orca, Big Mama, had slammed into the Lorna Doom and squirted my new pacemaker out onto the deck. Look who's awake! Arrgh! It's Iron Man! Come and join us! The hunting party and crew were gathered around the dinner table in the galley. Everybody on the boat was sitting there, grinning, laughing, and chanting, Iron Man! Iron Man! Iron Man! Who's driving the boat? I inquired. Don't worry, laddie buck. We're all now safely anchored just off the beach of the mainland at our secret cove, exactly where we're supposed to be, said Captain Dan. And tomorrow morning at first light, Vicious Al Lee, the best bush pilot in the land of the midnight sun, will land his pontoon plane right here beside us, and then it's just a 2-hour flight to Monsoon Lake, where the bears are. Arrgh! Iron Man! Iron Man! Iron Man! Captain Dan cleared a space beside him on the bench in the galley, patted the worn hard wood and said, Come sit beside me, laddie buck, and keep that 12-volt battery close to your chest. You're hardwired to it. I sat up slowly, cradling the big battery in my left arm and using my right hand to ease myself down off the cleaning station slab. I staggered over and took a seat between Captain Dan and Mr. Curtis. I didn't feel too bad, really. Listen to that fucker go, said Mr. Curtis. The rowdy mob all leaned in and listened as my heart was beating like a bass drum. The entire crew began pounding their fists on the galley table in concert with the metronomic thud of my newly enhanced ticker. Bam, 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 bam. Iron Man, Iron Man, bam, bam. Wah-ha-ha-ha-ha. A toast, demanded Captain Dan. To the hunt, to the hunt. Shots of the good rum were poured out all around, and we raised our glasses as one and slammed them home. Arrgh! Wah-ha-ha-ha! Another shot was poured, and the ritual repeated until the quart of Goldeneye rum was drained. Fetch another bottle of Goldeneye, Dr. Squiggy. Arrgh! Wah-ha-ha! Captain, began Dr. Squiggy. That was the last bottle of Goldeneye. Captain Dan's face grew serious, and for a long moment his visage grew dark. It was not a good omen to run out of the good rum before the hunt had really begun. Then the skies cleared and the light returned to Captain Dan's face. To the chum bucket, he roared. The chum bucket, filled with rock gut rum from the disinfecting of the surgical tools, was quickly brought to the galley table, and shots were poured out all around. Arrgh! Wah-ha-ha-ha! The party raged on through the night. Sea shanties were sung. origin stories and legends recounted. These men were in their element, none more so than Lucky Larry, the senior member of the hunting party. "What has one arm, one leg, one eye, and a chewed-off ear?" asked Philistine Ted to the table, who repeated Captain Dan's query as one. "What has one arm, one leg, one eye, and a chewed-off ear?" The entire table answered the question in perfect concert. "Lucky Larry! Wah-ha-ha-ha-ha!" Lucky Larry was old enough to be the other men's father, and there was some evidence to suggest that he had fathered at least a couple of the men aboard the Lorna Doom. His one good eye, cobalt blue, burned with an otherworldly light, much like the twin orbs of Philistine Ted, and the thick fur that grew on the bottom of his feet and crept up through his long toes was a close match to the thatches of brown hair that thatched the soles of Captain Dan himself. But these were just rumors and suppositions. The truth was lost in the records room. The truth was lost in the records room fire at the baby factory in Whittier many years ago. What was accepted as fact was that Lucky Larry lost an eye and the top half of his left ear in a marital dispute with Junaluska Jane, his common-law wife, who hunts alone, feared and respected, and rarely sighted except near the baby clinic in Whittier during mating season. And Lucky Larry's left arm, missing below the elbow, was lost in a skirmish with the hell-bent orca Big Mama some years before, when Captain Dan had harpooned the giant demon's adolescent child, skinned it, and made his treasured hunting jacket from its hide. And Lucky Larry's right leg, missing below the knee, had been a meal for a giant grizzly that had a patch of white fur in the middle of its forehead that matched the one in the middle of Lucky Larry's pate on a hunting trip some years hence. "Lucky Larry, Lucky Larry, Lucky Larry," the men chanted. And as a steady stream of shots were poured out from the rock gut rum in the chum bucket, Lucky Larry responded with a recitation of the epic poem, The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Buck did not read the newspapers, Lucky Larry began, in a slow, measured voice, or he would have known that trouble was brewing. All eyes were on Lucky Larry as he kicked the dust off of London's epic. Not alone for himself, Lucky Larry continued, but for every Tidewater dog, strong of muscle and with warm, long hair, from Puget Sound to San Diego, because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamships and transportation companies were booming the find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. Lucky Larry recited the entire epic poem, finishing up as the morning light appeared on the horizon. And right on cue, Vicious Al Lee, the best bush pilot in the permafrost, landed his pontoon plane in the still water right beside us. "He's always right on time, unless he's blind drunk," explained Captain Dan. "And even when he's on time, he's usually blind drunk," added Philistine Ted. Vicious Al Lee tossed a couple of ropes over the bow of the Lorna Doom, and Mr. Curtis and Philistine Ted tied the seaplane, the Demon Hawk, tightly to the Lorna Doom. We transferred our gear into the hold of the pontoon plane and were soon taxiing across the still waters of the Bay of Alaska and taking off into the clear blue sky without incident. Once airborne, I was introduced to Vicious Al Lee, who noticed that my chest was hardwired to the 12-volt Marine battery in my lap. He didn't ask any questions and just said, "I wouldn't let that get wet if I was you." The skies were initially clear, but as we got closer and deeper into the interior, approaching Monsoon Lake, where Vicious Al would land the Demon Hawk, As we could all see, a big squall was coming in from the west. Vicious Al turned towards the incoming storm and banked the Demon Hawk into a tight arc, coming round and lining up Monsoon Lake, just now coming into view in the front window and preparing to land. Captain Dan once again produced the drop-stoppered vial of Dr. Squiggy's magic liquid from the breast pocket of his orca skin jacket. He squirted a few drops under everyone's tongues. Lucky Larry abstained. He was obviously on a mission, and we prepared to land. Mr. Curtis, sitting just behind Vicious Al, made his signature move, reaching around the pilot's chair and clamping his hands over Vicious Al's eyes. "You fucker, not again," screamed the drunken bush pilot. "Breathe through your eyes, see through your nose. Wah-ha-ha-ha," howled Mr. Curtis, his wild eyes shining above the wide, psychotic, tobacco-stained grin, his hands clamped tightly across Vicious Al's upper face. "You fucker, we're all gonna die," screamed Vicious Al. "See through your nose, motherfucker. Wah-ha-ha-ha." Mr. Curtis released his grip upon Vicious Al's face, just in time to avert disaster, and the finest drunken bush pilot north of the lower 48 put the Demon Hawk's pontoons down safely in the waters of Monsoon Lake, taxiing to a stop 50 yards off of the north shore, about 2 miles from the hunting party's long-established bush camp. Vicious Al produced a large hunting knife and held it close to Mr. Curtis's throat. The entire hunting party burst into uproarious laughter. Wah-ha-ha-ha-ha. "Oh, fuck, you heathens are even more out of control than usual. Get your shit and have fun, you maniacs. See you in about 3 days. I gotta get the fuck out of here." We disembarked, trudging through the frigid, shallow waters. I was extra careful not to stumble and get my battery wet. Vicious Al had the Demon Hawk back up and in the air before we'd even reached the shore. We trudged and made camp, set up our tents, gathered wood, and made a fire. I wish that I could say it went smoothly, but it was absolute chaos. Everybody but Lucky Larry was tripping balls and jabbering like lunatics and careening through the snowpack of the pristine Alaskan evergreen forests with wild abandon. No self-respecting bear would dare venture anywhere near our camp, at least not until the acid ran out and the lunatics brought it down a couple of notches. The lunacy lasted through the first long Alaskan night. Nobody slept. Nobody ate. With the dawn, Captain Dan shared the last drops from his vial and turned it upside down for effect. There was a collective sigh of resignation that the party would soon die down. But then, with impeccable timing, Dr. Squiggy produced another stoppered bottle of the clear liquid and held it aloft in the morning light. "Arg! Yay! Wah-ha-ha-ha!" roared the hunting party. Game on. I remained tethered to my 12-volt battery, my heart beating loud and strong. The 3 days and nights at the hunting camp flew by in a lethargic blur. It was cold. It snowed on and off. We didn't see any bears. Nobody seemed to give a shit about any of it. In the evening, before our last night in camp, I went out prowling with Philistine Ted. I'd been carrying that 30-pound battery for 3 days, but it somehow seemed lighter, and I almost forgot about it as I stalked through a thicket, flanking Philistine Ted. And then Philistine Ted and I simultaneously heard some rustling and grunting coming from the thick brush behind us. We whirled around to confront what sounded like a huge bear. Philistine Ted shouldered his Mauser 454 elephant rifle and leveled it at the rustling in the thicket. We marched straight ahead, Philistine Ted with his finger on the Mauser's trigger, me clearing brush with my free hand. And then we saw the culprits causing the commotion. It was Mr. Curtis, naked above the waist, his thick brown back hair glistening in the evening light, sharing some berries with an enormous female grizzly. The pair seemed very contented. It was a real kumbaya moment. The last night at the hunting camp got pretty wild. We drained Dr. Squiggy's vial of liquid LSD and danced and howled like utter fucking maniacs around the campfire until the coming of the cold dawn, when we broke camp and trudged down to the shore of Monsoon Lake to make our rendezvous with Vicious Al and the Demon Hawk. Captain Dan emerged from the forest first, and as the rest of us reached the beach, we witnessed Captain Dan shouldered his modified single-shot 50 caliber rifle. "Moose jerky," he whispered. "Kabam!" The monstrous moose, wading in the water 20 yards out, was dropped with a single headshot, and Captain Dan unsheathed his Bowie knife and stormed into the shallows of Monsoon Lake. "That's illegal," warned Philistine Ted. "You know it's not moose season." "Jerky," called out Captain Dan over his shoulder as he hurried towards his kill. We all watched in stunned silence as Captain Dan went to work like a banshee, his knife flashing and slashing with speed, skill, and purpose. He butchered 200 pounds of prime backstrap from the 1,000-pound beast and packed it all in snow in his provisions box. Then he used some good rope to tie a huge rock to the rest of the illegal kill, and as the Demon Hawk came into view in the eastern sky, the moose carcass sank to the bottom of Monsoon Lake. The blood in the water was still dispersing as the Demon Hawk landed and taxied into the shallows. As I waded out to the pontoon plane, dragging my camping gear and the 12-volt marine battery that was hardwired to the pacemaker that Captain Dan and Dr. Squiggy had reinstalled in my chest, I did a quick head count. I saw Captain Dan, Dr. Squiggy, Mr. Curtis, and Philistine Ted. "Where's Lucky Larry?" I called out. And just then, there came a monstrous roar. Just then, there came a monstrous roar and a human scream. All eyes turned back towards the shore, where we witnessed Lucky Larry fighting to the death with the biggest grizzly that any of the veteran hunting party had ever seen. The monstrous brown bear, sporting a familiar thatch of white fur in the middle of its forehead, was chewing on Lucky Larry's one good leg as Lucky Larry plunged his knife deep into the bear's heart, and they died in each other's arms there on the beach of Monsoon Lake. We didn't go back to the beach. It was no use. And the conversation was mostly silence as Vicious Al Lee lifted the Demon Hawk into the sky for our return flight to the secret cove where we debarked from the Lorna Doone. The silence was so complete that all you could hear was the jackhammering of my augmented heart. It was to be a short flight, barely 2 hours, but a nasty-looking storm was coming in quickly from the north, and things got dicey fast. Sheets of rain and gale-force winds pelted us from all directions. A lightning strike took out one of our engines. Vicious Al put out an emergency call on his radio. "Mayday, mayday! This is the Demon Hawk. Over." Vicious Al turned towards me, desperation in his eyes, and screamed above the din. "Your heartbeat is interfering with the radio. Disconnect the pacemaker from the 12-volt battery or we're all going to die." Fuck it. It was a good day to be a hero. So I yanked out the new copper leads from the 12-volt marine battery that was hardwired to the pacemaker in my chest. My heartbeat instantly slowed and became more erratic, and I began to get sleepy. I hadn't slept in 4 nights. I didn't feel too bad. I didn't really wanted to go to sleep. As I drifted off, I heard Vicious Al on the radio with the air traffic controller. "Demon Hawk, this is air traffic control in Olga Bay." "Thank God," said Vicious Al. "Thank you, Iron Man," said Captain Dan. And those were the last things that I heard before I fell into a deep sleep that I figured might be my last. My wife, Kelly, recounted the last bit of this story to me, as I have no recollection of it. "Dr. Atiga came into the waiting room and told me that the surgery went well and that you were back here in the recovery room, beginning to wake up from the anesthesia, and that I could come back here and be with you. All the lights were off in the recovery rooms, and the curtains were all drawn, and they all looked the same anyway, and I walked right past you the first time. Then I turned around and retraced my steps, and I heard a deep voice from behind one of the curtains say, "I am Iron Man." The nurses at the nurses' station all cracked up, and I said, "That's my husband." And that was Bear Hunting on Acid, dedicated to the memory of Captain Dan Aschenbrenner. And you've been listening to 90% Half True. I'm Keith Patterson, and this is the first podcast of the year, January 21st, 2025. Much love to you all, and have a great day from Castle Keep, and the Cosmic Harvest Gallery. Love you. Bye-bye.